Did you know there are places on Earth where fresh water simply does not exist? No rivers, no lakes, no springs you can drink from? Dig down, and in some of these places, the ground is either bone dry or full of salt. And yet, people live there, sometimes tens of thousands of them, sometimes entire nations, surviving on rain they trap off their own roofs, on water squeezed out of fog, or on machines that turn the sea into something you can drink. Switch those machines off, and some of these places would have only days left. Today, we're counting down every kind of place on Earth where people live with no fresh water at all, from the ones that solved it so cleverly you'd never notice, all the way to the single most desperate place on the planet, where the ocean is now winning. And each one is living closer to the edge than the last. There's a place on this list that had to build a fake forest, thousands of trees dragged across the ocean and planted on bare volcanic rock, for one reason, to trick the sky into giving it water. Number 8 is a glittering city of skyscrapers and fountains that is, at any given moment, only a few days away from running completely dry. And the final place isn't a town or a city, it's an entire country, where the sea is rising up through the ground itself, turning the last of the fresh water to salt, and it may become the first nation on Earth that has to be abandoned because it ran out of something to drink. But let's start with number 1, a lush, green island in the middle of the Atlantic, where 65,000 people live, surrounded by water on every side, and there is not one river, one lake, or one natural spring anywhere on it. And they figured out how to survive over 400 years ago, using nothing but the shape of their own roofs. Bermuda looks like the last place on Earth that should have a water problem. It's a lush, subtropical chain of islands in the Atlantic, green and warm and soaked with rain. But look closer and you'll notice something strange. There are no rivers, no streams, no freshwater lakes, and no springs. The island is made of porous limestone, so any rain that falls just drains straight down through the rock and out to sea, before anyone can use it. Around 65,000 people live here, plus roughly 500,000 tourists a year, and the ground beneath them holds almost no fresh water they can drink. So how has anyone lived here since 1612? The answer is sitting on top of every single house, and once you know to look for it, you can't unsee it. Every traditional Bermudian roof is bright white, and built in a series of shallow steps, like a little limestone staircase climbing to the peak. That design is not for looks. Those steps are a rain-catching machine. When it rains, the stepped ridges slow the water down so it can't overshoot, and channel it into gutters, and from there, down into a covered tank, built underneath or beside the house. Every home is, in effect, its own private reservoir. The white lime coating even helps purify the water as it runs. And this isn't a suggestion, it's the law. In Bermuda, for every square foot of roof you build, you are legally required to provide 8 gallons of tank storage beneath it, and to capture the rain off at least 80% of your roof. You are not allowed to build a home that can't catch its own water. An entire nation, running for 4 centuries on nothing but rainfall, and the clever geometry of a roof. It's the most elegant solution on this whole list, which is exactly why it goes first. Because our next place couldn't rely on gentle Atlantic rain. It was a fortress, built to survive a siege, and it needed water on a scale you could see from space. At the mouth of the Mediterranean stands the Rock of Gibraltar, a giant limestone monolith, barely 3 square miles, packed for centuries with soldiers, guns, and tunnels. It's one of the most fought over pieces of land in Europe, and for all its military strength, Gibraltar had one crippling weakness that no cannon could fix. It had almost no fresh water. A bare rock with a growing town and a garrison on it, and not a river or a proper spring to its name. In a siege, water, not gunpowder, was the thing most likely to kill you. For a long time they scraped by on wells and cisterns and shipped in supplies, but by the early 1900s, that wasn't enough. So the British did something genuinely astonishing. On the great sandy eastern slope of the rock, starting in 1903, they laid down an enormous artificial catchment. Sheets of corrugated iron bolted across roughly 45 hectares of hillside, turning the entire flank of the mountain into a hard surface, designed to catch rain and funnel it down into reservoirs carved inside the rock itself. From a distance, it looked like someone had draped the mountain in silver. Rain that hit those iron sheets couldn't soak away, it ran straight down into a series of underground reservoirs, 12 of them in the end, holding on the order of 70,000 cubic meters of water inside the stone. For decades, this giant metal hillside was one of the main things keeping Gibraltar alive, a fortress that drank from its own mountainside. And then, in 1991, it was declared obsolete, not because they'd found a spring, but because technology had finally offered a better answer: desalination. Machines that turned the Mediterranean itself into drinking water. The Great Iron Slopes were dismantled and the hillside reseeded, and today, Gibraltar drinks almost entirely from the sea. But at least Gibraltar had rain to catch, and a sea right there to distill. Our next place had a far crueler problem, a place so hot and so dry that people didn't just struggle to find water, they had to go underground to survive the heat at all. In the middle of the South Australian outback, hundreds of miles from anywhere, there is a town where more than half the population lives underground, inside caves carved into the hillsides. This is Coober Pedy, the opal mining capital of the world, and it exists in one of the most hostile environments any permanent town on Earth has to face. Summer temperatures regularly climb past 40 degrees Celsius, well over 100 Fahrenheit, and the average rainfall is a pitiful 160 millimeters a year, much of which evaporates almost before it lands. People here dug their homes into the earth, dugouts, simply because underground it stays cool while the surface bakes. But you can hide from the heat underground, you cannot hide from thirst. And Coober Pedy has no river, no lake, no reliable rain, nothing. In the town's early days, after opal was found here in 1915, water was so scarce that it had to be carried in on the backs of camels, 2 barrels at a time, hauled across 60-odd kilometers of desert. For years, water here was worth more than the opals people were digging for. Even into the 1960s, residents were rationed to about 25 gallons of water per person per week for everything. Today, Coober Pedy survives on a very modern kind of magic. Deep beneath the desert lies an aquifer, but the water in it is salty, undrinkable straight from the ground. So the town pipes it up from a bore about 25 kilometers away and pushes it through a reverse osmosis desalination plant, squeezing the salt out and producing up to 1.4 million liters of clean water a day. An entire town living underground in the desert, drinking desalinated water pumped out of the earth beneath one of the driest landscapes on the planet. Coober Pedy fought its environment and won. But our next place did something even stranger. Instead of digging down for water, its people tried to reach up and grow their own rain. Out in the middle of the South Atlantic, roughly halfway between Africa and South America, there's a small volcanic island that, when humans first arrived, was about as close to a dead world as anywhere on Earth. Ascension Island was a heap of red-brown lava and cinder cones, barely 1 million years old, with almost no soil, almost no plants, and, critically, almost no fresh water. When the Royal Navy garrisoned it in the 1800s, they faced a brutal problem. How do you keep people alive on a barren rock where it hardly ever rains? The answer came from one of the most famous minds in science. In 1836, Charles Darwin visited Ascension aboard the Beagle and described it as a place almost destitute of trees. A few years later, the great botanist Joseph Hooker looked at the problem and proposed something that sounds insane. Don't just ship water to the island, terraform it. Plant trees, thousands of them, near the top of the island's highest peak, and let them do the work. The idea was that trees and vegetation, high on the mountain, would catch moisture out of the passing clouds and mist, shade the ground, build soil, and hold water in the land, instead of letting it run straight off the bare rock. So through the 1850s, the Navy did exactly that, importing shiploads of saplings from botanical gardens across the world and planting them on the summit. Within about 20 years, over 5,000 trees had taken root. And it worked. A man-made cloud forest slowly grew across the top of a dead volcano. Rainfall increased, the soil deepened. Today, the summit, now called Green Mountain, is a lush, green, dripping forest about 7 degrees cooler than the barren lowlands, with a pond of fresh water at the top that simply did not exist before humans built it. It is one of the only places on Earth where people, faced with no water, essentially grew their own weather. But growing a forest to catch mist can support a few hundred people. Our next place had to find water for an entire modern nation. Millions of people in a desert with nothing but the sea. Kuwait sits on the northwestern edge of the Persian Gulf, and it is, by almost any measure, one of the most water-poor countries on the planet. There are no permanent rivers, no lakes, barely any rain. For most of its history, this was a small desert society clinging to the coast, and finding enough to drink was a daily struggle that shaped the entire nation. The story of how Kuwait drank before the modern age is almost unbelievable. When the local wells couldn't keep up, especially after a harsh drought in the early 1900s, Kuwait began importing its drinking water by boat, sailing it in from the Shatt al-Arab River in Iraq. A fleet of large wooden dhows, around 49 of them, ferried something like 80,000 gallons of fresh water across the Gulf every day. In the city, water sellers carried it through the streets by hand and on the backs of donkeys, selling it tin by tin, an entire country, drinking water shipped in from another country's river. Then came oil and money, and a new idea that would change everything. In 1953, Kuwait commissioned one of the world's first large distillation plants to boil seawater and condense the steam into fresh water, producing 1 million gallons a day. It was the beginning of a transformation so complete that today, Kuwait gets roughly 90% of its water from the sea, through a network of massive desalination plants running around the clock, a nation of millions in a rainless desert drinking the Persian Gulf. Kuwait proved a whole country could live on desalinated seawater, but it had the sea and it had oil money to burn. Our next place had neither, just fog and a desert where it essentially never rains at all. Along the northern coast of Chile lies the Atacama, the driest non-polar desert on Earth. There are weather stations here that have gone years without recording measurable rain. Some spots may never have recorded any at all. It is a landscape of cracked earth and bare rock that looks more like Mars than anywhere you'd expect to find a village. And yet, tucked into this desert, there was a small fishing village called Chungungo, whose people faced a simple, grinding reality. The sky would not give them water, and there was none in the ground. For years, Chungungo survived on water trucked in from far away and stored in old oil drums. Expensive, unreliable, and never enough. But the desert here has one strange gift. Rolling in off the cold Pacific, a thick coastal fog called the Comanchica drifts over the hills almost every day, a river of moisture in the air, floating right over a village dying of thirst. And in the late 1980s, researchers asked a beautiful question. What if you could catch it? So on a ridge above the village, at a place called El Tofo, they built something that looked like a row of enormous volleyball nets, roughly 100 large mesh screens, standing up into the path of the fog. As the Comanchica blew through the mesh, tiny droplets of water condensed on the fibers, ran down into gutters, and collected in tanks. Through a 7-kilometer pipeline, that water flowed down to Chungungo. At its best, the nets pulled an average of 15,000 liters of clean drinking water out of the fog every single day. On peak days, over 100,000 liters. Water, quite literally, harvested from thin air, in a place where it does not rain. The village grew, gardens appeared. People who had left began to come back. And then, heartbreakingly, it fell apart. Through the early 2000s, the project was neglected. Local politics turned to other supplies, and by 2003, not a single working fog collector was left standing. The village went back to trucked in water. It remains one of the most bittersweet lessons on this list. They solved the impossible, caught water out of the clouds, and then let it slip through their fingers. Our next place couldn't afford to lose its water for even a day, because for a while, a giant wave took it all at once. The Maldives are what most people picture when they hear the word paradise. Over 1,000 low coral islands scattered across the Indian Ocean, ringed by turquoise water and white sand. But that beauty hides one of the most fragile water situations anywhere on Earth. These islands are tiny and flat, most of them barely a meter or two above the sea, and they have no rivers and no lakes. Traditionally, the only fresh water was a thin, delicate layer of rain-fed groundwater floating on top of the heavier salt water soaked into the coral beneath, what's called a freshwater lens. It's like a shallow bubble of drinkable water resting on the sea. Puncture it, or overuse it, and the salt comes up to meet you. And on the morning of December 26th, 2004, the sea came up all at once. The Indian Ocean tsunami swept across the Maldives, and because the islands are so low, the waves washed clean over many of them entirely. In seconds, salt water flooded across the land and poured down into the ground, straight into those fragile freshwater lenses. On island after island, the only source of drinking water they had was ruined in a single morning, poisoned with salt. A country that was already short of fresh water suddenly had far less, across dozens of communities at once. The Maldives has spent the years since fighting to survive that vulnerability. The capital, Male, one of the most densely packed cities on Earth, now runs almost entirely on desalination. And when a fire crippled the main desalination plant there in 2014, the city of over 100,000 people was left scrambling. as fresh water had to be shipped and flown in from abroad. Across the outer islands, life now depends on rainwater tanks and small desalination units, with boats carrying emergency water between islands in the dry season. A nation of paradise islands, where a single wave, a single fire, or a single bad drought can cut off the water entirely. But the Maldives, for all its fragility, is spread across a vast ocean. Our next place concentrated the same impossible problem into one dazzling vertical city, and it lives permanently on a knife's edge. Fly into Dubai, and you see one of the most spectacular skylines on Earth, the tallest building in the world, fountains dancing in the desert, golf courses and swimming pools glittering under a sun that can hit 50 degrees Celsius. It looks like a triumph over nature. But it is built on top of one of the most extreme water situations of any place humans have ever gathered in these numbers. The United Arab Emirates has essentially no natural fresh water, no rivers, almost no rain. What little groundwater exists is largely salty and running out. Nearly everything that comes out of a tap in Dubai and Abu Dhabi began as seawater in the Persian Gulf. The entire country is kept alive by desalination plants running 24 hours a day, turning the Gulf into drinking water on a colossal scale. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Across the Gulf states, the amount of water actually stored in the system at any given moment, in reservoirs and pipes, is typically only enough for a few days. A city of skyscrapers, millions of people, in a desert where it may not rain for months, sitting on a buffer of just days. If those desalination plants were knocked offline by a power failure, a major storm, an oil spill fouling the intakes, an attack, the countdown to a catastrophe would be measured not in weeks, but in hours and days. The authorities know exactly how dangerous this is. That's why, out in the Liwa Desert, Abu Dhabi built one of the largest strategic water reserves on Earth, injecting tens of millions of cubic meters of desalinated water down into the sand to store it, enough to supply the capital for around 90 days in an emergency. Think about what that means. A nation so devoid of fresh water that its emergency plan is to hide a lake underground in the desert just in case the machines stop. It is modern civilization built directly on top of the void, brilliant, glittering, and permanently a few days from thirst. But at least the UAE has the wealth and the technology to hold the line. Our final place has almost none of that, and the ocean isn't just its neighbor, it's coming for the ground under their feet. In the middle of the vast Pacific, there is a country so small and so low that most people have never heard its name. Tuvalu is a nation of 9 coral atolls, home to around 11,000 people, and its highest point of natural land stands just 4.5 meters, about 15 feet, above the sea. There are no rivers here, no mountains, no streams. And the thin freshwater lens that once sat beneath the islands, that same fragile bubble of rain-soaked water, has been steadily poisoned by the rising ocean seeping up through the porous coral from below. Today, across much of Tuvalu, the groundwater is simply too salty to drink. For their fresh water, the people of Tuvalu depend on two things and two things only: the rain they catch off their roofs into tanks, and the desalination machines that turn the sea into water. There is no backup beneath their feet. The ground has been taken. And that leaves the entire nation balanced on the weather. When the rain fails, there is nothing to fall back on. In 2011, a powerful La Niña choked off the rainfall for months, and Tuvalu watched its water simply run out. The government declared a state of emergency. On the capital atoll of Funafuti, families were rationed down to as little as 2 buckets of water a day for drinking, cooking, washing, everything. Some communities were reported to be within just days of having no fresh water at all. New Zealand and Australia scrambled to fly in emergency desalination units and containers of water to keep people alive. 12 years later, in 2023, another drought brought the rationing back again. This is not a one-time disaster for Tuvalu. It is the shape of the future. Because the thing squeezing Tuvalu is not going away, it's rising. As sea levels climb, salt water pushes further into the ground, king tides wash across the land, and the freshwater lens shrinks toward nothing. Tuvalu has become one of the clearest symbols on Earth of a terrifying new possibility, an entire country that may, within our lifetimes, become uninhabitable, not because the land vanishes overnight, but because it can no longer hold any water its people can drink. There is talk of relocating the entire population. There is even a project to preserve Tuvalu as a digital nation online, so that the country continues to exist even if the islands themselves cannot. Of every place on this list, this is the one living closest to the edge, a nation of 11,000 people, standing 4 meters above an ocean that is rising up through the ground to take the last of their fresh water. And unlike a fortress or a desert town, there may be no engineering our way out of this one. When the water is gone, the country goes with it. What gets me about this whole list is how thin the line really is. We think of fresh water as just there, something that falls from the sky and runs in the ground, and always will. But for millions of people, on green Atlantic islands, in glittering desert cities, on coral atolls in the middle of the Pacific, that line has already been crossed. They live with no natural fresh water at all, held up entirely by clever roofs, by machines, by fog nets, by trees they planted themselves. Take those away, and some of these places have only days. And more of the world is starting to look like this list. So I'm curious, which of these places surprised you the most? The island that grew its own rain? The city that's always a few days from dry? Or the country the ocean is quietly erasing? And could you live somewhere your next drink of water depends entirely on a machine that must never stop? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this one, go check out the video on screen right now. I think you'll like it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.